And so this is not a sermon. It is not to be a sermon. We got a sermon coming. But I find it helpful to ground by lifting a couple of scriptures, and then I'll share more church history than I will biblical lesson. Love ye therefore the stranger, for ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Deuteronomy 10, looking at the 18th and 19th verses. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for ye know the heart of a stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Found in Exodus, the 23rd chapter, the 9th verse. We consider strangers in the scriptures. We're talking about foreigners, outsiders, immigrants, those who find themselves or seek to find themselves in land and space with you because they understand their hopes to be different. Perhaps on the other side of a border, after getting off a plane, after navigating around a wall. This week we have been visited with those perhaps who have forgotten what it feels like to be a stranger, to be a foreigner, to be an outsider. That happens most significantly when one finds oneself in power, and one becomes the establishment. When one rides a wave of outsiders or perceived outsiders to the center of power and forgets one's own history, one's own heritage, one's own background, the immigrant status of one's own parents and foreparents. Then one begins to act on strangers and foreigners and marginalized people as if they are less than oneself. What is most significant and challenging with this is when one has the authority, or seemingly the authority of government, and particularly the imprimatur of empire on one side. Whether that empire is the empire, the empirical economy of Egypt, or that empire is the basileia of Rome, whether that power is signified by a talisman or a signet upon the ring of Caesar, or by the seal of the presidency of the United States of America. When empire forgets its history, and when those in power forget that they were once marginalized, we find ourselves in dangerous places. In 1948, a power called the Nationalist Party came again to authority in South Africa. This was officially named the Afrikaans National Party, a party of white Africans who were formerly immigrants who at one point had to make the case for their whiteness to the Europeans who came to oppress them. They had built for themselves a theology of liberation that centered themselves as chosen by God. And over time, from being marginalized outsiders to become the party in power, based upon a theology of chosenness, rooted in a sense and a semblance of liberation for themselves, they were all of a sudden the political party in power, again, in 1948 in South Africa. But because perhaps they forgot their outsider status, and perhaps because they had a theology of supremacy that was rooted originally in liberation, they began to establish a form of government, an official state-sponsored, state-enforced system of segregation called apartheid that ruled until 1994. These Afrikaans, These who began to perhaps bow at the pulpit of and genuflex at the flag of white supremacy in the name of Christian theology, took over the government of South Africa and reigned there to oppress and segregate people into townships and neighborhoods that they still live in to this day, even 20 plus years after democratic governance. They did it before the political strategy and before the political power, as rooted in a theology that called themselves chosen and that feigned liberation for God's people. We ought remember our church history. It is also helpful for us to recall and to remember that in the time that the Afrikaans came to power the first time in 1915, we were also in the space of world war. A world war that called this matter of God and country into question in sanctuaries in this sanctuary, and sanctuaries like this one across the United States of America, populated by marginalized people who did not speak the King's English, rather their German tongue. And because the country and the government found itself on the other side of war with their homeland, they themselves came under attack. And the places where they gathered as haven, as safe place, as sanctuary, their churches came under attack as well. Under such attack that they began to confuse God and country. Because to protect themselves, they hung American flags in this sanctuary. To protect themselves, they placed plaques at the front door that said the names of those who were members of this German congregation that served on the U.S. side in those wars. In the interest of patriotism, they told the world, "We are with you, government. Don't oppress us." And unfortunately, over time, the cross and the flag came to be confused in church spaces in America, where people wrapped themselves in the flag and bowed to the cross and began to forget which was which. And we ought also know, for those who populate this church today, of the unique confusion that shows up in American history, when in many Methodist churches, pastors are forced, particularly here in the state of Missouri, stories are told, of Methodist churches that serve both Southerners and those from the Union side and worship in the same spaces. And because the same meetings happen in the same space, when some meetings happen, the flag is held up and even pinned up. And a litmus test for pastors in this state became whether they would walk out under the flag that was planted above the door in the sanctuary. This was tied to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the state and in America, the raising of the flag in the church. The theological foundation and basis for a nationalism that others the stranger, the foreigner, and the marginalized person. If we know our history, our friends, then we connect the dots. And I am not one to argue against people like Dr. Cornel West. I am one of a growing group of Americans who has shared a cell with him. It's a large group of Americans. But I am clear that pointing to the fascism of Germans, including those who are connected to those who are marginalized in this space at one point in history, may help us to point to government and the issues of government without understanding, appreciating, and owning the theological underpinnings and undergirdings of these very declarations, executive orders, and movements. It may help us to feel self-righteous about being wonderful Christians who are good enough to be middle-class folk who have a church membership. Make us feel good about going out to protest and not engaging in the long-term work of agitation, reorganization, reform, and transformation. It may not help us to do the critical work of deeply engaging our own theologies, understanding those theologies, and how they have implications for the social realities and manifestations of the decades to come. You do not get a radical right in America in the 1990s without deep theological work happening in churches and in conservative seminaries in the 1960s and 70s. You do not get a radical reformation or revolution, to use King's words, of values in the United States of America without theologies of liberation being understood not just in seminaries, but in congregations. You do not get a justice-loving, justice-rooted movement of power if the people in the pews do not understand the historical realities of a radical revolutionary Jesus, the roots of justice that are called for in the Old Testament based upon deep study and reflection on the scriptures. Anything else is a weak foundation of a liberal secular movement in Christ's face. And so the work that we have to do, if we will do the work for the long term, is yes, to be in the streets, and yes, to be at the debate today at 3 o'clock at St. Louis University. Yes, to call leaders to account, but for the long-term work, to be in Bible study, studying the liberative roots of our theology, understanding them for ourselves so we don't have to call somebody to explain it to our friends, and having it be the motivating factor for what takes us to the streets, what keeps us in the struggle, so we may work to articulate a vision for the long term. That's more of a charge than a pastoral word, so I'll close with a pastoral word. The pastoral word is one that was popularized by Martin Luther King Jr. and one that he found in a book, The Souls of Black Folk by W.B. Du Bois, but it was written by James Russell Lowell. It's kind of how folk feel this day in the beginning, but I hope it's what people know in the end. Truth forever on the scaffold. Wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God in the shadows, keeping watch above God's arm.